Good evening. In this episode we will attempt, within the usual time limits, a brief history of the development of universities in Europe. And we may start by asking, did the Romans or the Greeks have universities? And if not, how could they build such extraordinary works of engineering that have stood the test of time and that seem impossible to create without an extensive education in mathematics, in mechanical engineering, drawing, physics, and so on? Think about the aqueducts or the dome, like the one in the Pantheon in Rome, really an invention that enables the ceiling of a building to stand up without columns in the middle. Then the Colosseum, the bridges, and so on. We know they had teachers, especially of literary subjects and mathematics, but we lack documentation showing us, besides generalities, one day in the life of a Roman student. In civil engineering, Vitruvius wrote a famous treatise on architecture, but we don't know how people learned to build arches, establish sizes, estimate or calculate stress, strain, loads, etc. We must therefore assume the students were apprentices who, depending on the level of skill required, were taught by private masters. We have Latin books about education, notably by Cicero and Quintilian, who taught the art of speaking, especially in public, but we can say with some confidence that there were not universities, which are the subject of our historical sketch. As we remember, or you may remember, Emperor Diocletian in the third century split the Western Roman Empire, and that kept its capital in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which eventually, with Constantine, had its capital in Constantinople, Istanbul. However, as regards the West, the Western Roman Empire took a new shape of its own only with the advent of Charlemagne and his coronation in 800 AD. Charlemagne called on an Anglo-Saxon monk by the name of Alcuin, plus some other learned clerics. And within his imperial palace he instituted an academy. Because, in the meantime, the mode of writing itself had become illegible. The Latin tongue, that had been lost through the influence of various idioms brought in by the barbarians, the Latin tongue was again made official. Ancient manuscripts kept in monasteries were recopied with great care. And the teaching of letters and of science were resumed in ecclesiastical schools. However, the university, in the sense that we think of it today, came about only after the year 1000. At the time, knowledge was considered as an entity on its own, but divided into 7 branches called the 7 liberal arts. And in fact, medieval manuscripts represented knowledge as a tree, the tree of knowledge, and from the trunk of which came out 7 branches, one for each art: grammar, rhetoric, dialectics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. This fresco, contained in the church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, shows the triumph of Thomas Aquinas. You can see in the middle of the picture. The left section shows 7 female figures representing the sacred sciences, whereas the right section shows the 7 liberal arts. The figures at the foot of each art represent a master, brilliant in the corresponding discipline. Where these masters were, we don't know, and to know them we would need to interview the fine painter of this picture, Andrea di Buonaiuto, who painted it from 1365 to 1367. The study of the 7 liberal arts was a preparation for deeper studies in what was called philosophy, but not the same philosophy that we think of today. Philosophy was divided into disciplines dealing with nature, disciplines dealing with morals, and disciplines dealing with metaphysics, or if you like, the unknown, the supernatural. This evolution or revolution in learning followed the principles derived from Aristotle, whose works had been translated from Greek into Arabic in Spain, and then from Arabic into Latin. Spain, or Andalus, as it was then called, had been conquered by the Arabs and the Moors and had developed a flourishing, independent culture that left important marks in Western European culture. In any event, the works and philosophy of Aristotle, Plato, and others were or became the foundation of the development of Western European learning. And, more importantly, the conjunction, if you like, of Christianity and Greek philosophy set the tone, the form, and the substance of what we refer to as European culture, now under fierce attack by the enemies that will remain unmentioned. For, although knowledge was whole and much less subdivided and specialized as it is today, we yet begin to see in the first universities the opening of different faculties such as arts, medicine, law, and theology, meaning that the Middle Age university had to provide education in all acknowledged disciplines of the time, though, just as today we have the Ivy League universities, in the 1200 and 1300, different universities were famous for specific faculties. For example, Paris was famous for arts and theology, Bologna in Italy for the School of Law. And the development, or perhaps the vicissitudes, of the University of Paris would profoundly influence the history of Western culture at large. And why? As I said, the professors, thanks to the translation by the Persian Avicenna, whose name was Ibn Saud, and the Averroes, whose name was Ibn Rushd, introduced Aristotle in the faculty of theology, where, in the middle of the 13th century, two religious thinkers, one of whom was the well-known Thomas Aquinas, conducted and carried out, as I said, a synthesis between Christian culture and Greek classical thought. But the masters of the faculty of the arts, that is, went even further. Using the commentary of Averroes, these Parisian masters come up with the idea that, yes, one type of truth can only be known through faith. But there are also different types of truth, separate and independent, which, the truth that is, belong to the order of nature and can be reached by reason, not by faith. And it is through this combination of faith and reason that man, or rather the philosopher, can reach the limits of understanding, freedom and virtue, that is, the limits allowed to man. And although to us the idea of combining faith and reason seems nothing objectionable, it was not so in the Paris of the 13th century, and in 1270 the theses of the Averroists, as they were called, were condemned by the Pope through the Bishop of Paris. A meeting of the faculty was convened and those professors were expelled from the university. The curriculum of a university course was composed of a list of texts and books. Every faculty or discipline used the books of authors with proven and established competence in a specific subject. The instructors had to convey the content of those texts without any alteration. Partisans of the current European Union, of which I am not, like to point to the uniformity on the course of studies in medieval Europe as evidence of the ancient seed of a unified culture. But in reality, there were variants in the programs, especially those connected with art. For example, in some universities they read only text predating the foundation of that university, whereas at Oxford and Paris they read all the works of Aristotle being a key text for most theologians. But the curriculum of the Faculty of Medicine, for example, included classic authors like Galen and Hippocrates, as well as the medical text of Avicenna in 5 volumes, of which we see here an old page in the original Arabic. To teach law, they used the great works assembled by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century entitled The Body of Civil Rights. Canonical, that is, church law, was taught using a body of books called the Decretals. Here is an image from one of such decretals showing the devil getting ready to snatch the soul of a dying king who, the king, must have been up to no good. One thing is certain, medieval science was completely based on books. Now, the memory of my university studies suggests that they weren't much different from the Middle Ages, meaning that all learning was also based on books, but this, if you like, is an irrelevant aside. However, in the Middle Ages it wasn't as bad as it may sound when I say that all learning was based on books. Why? For each lecture would be divided into two parts. In the first, the teacher would read the text, whereas the second part of the lecture was called and consisted of the dispute. And to be able to intervene intelligently in the dispute, the student would have had already well in mind the text read by the teacher. But how could the student get books when printing only came about in the late 1400s with Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press? There was an important revolution in book distribution, if you like, coeval with the first universities in the 13th century. And the revolution had indeed to do with books. In the early Middle Ages, the typical book was produced in a special section of a monastery called the scriptorium. The books would remain in the monastery as part of the monastery treasure. They were a collective resource and were read aloud by one monk to all the others. Now, with the birth of the universities, the books began to be copied in urban writing shops, an activity that, in turn, created the trade of the professional copyist. But a method had to be devised enabling to meet the demand for copied texts because the original themselves were few and far between. They invented a system called the pecia, P-E-C-I-A, a corrupted Latin word for piece, meaning the largest piece that can be obtained from a leather skin in order to be written over. The original of the master book was given to people who formed a new category of employment. They were called the exemplatores, that is, trusted transcribers who subdivided the original text into pages or pieces, if you like, or a set of chapters. The exemplatores would then rent the examples to one further category of copyists down the line. The second-tier copyist, if you like, made several pages or pieces of each exemplar and then rent them to the students. Eventually, the students would copy the pages for their own use and reconstruct the books in whole or in part as needed. Or maybe they used some other copyist to copy the pages for them. And as you can imagine, it was not exactly easy to study in the University of the Middle Ages. And the costs were affordable only by the very few. And graduating wasn't easier either. For example, the student who wished to graduate in law at the University of Bologna, say in the middle of the 13th century, would reach the final examination only after eight years of study. The first phase of the final examination would involve an interview with the university teacher who would function, as they called it, as a presenter. This would be called a tentamen or a tentamen, a Latin for tentative, meaning that this interview wasn't at all easy, hence tentative, because the student could not be sure if he could progress to the next stage, tentative. In the next and even harder stage, the student would face the whole faculty. He had to comment part or a section of a book and answer the questions and objections raised by members of the examining faculty. This phase of the examination was called private or rigorous or tremendous, so you can imagine. And if the student passed the private exam, he would acquire a license in law. But only after the third phase, the public examination, the student would acquire the laurea, that is the Italianization of the Latin laurel, as in the Latin, which was the crown of laurel leaves, conferred in antiquity to top poets. And we retain this tradition, or at least the name, in the qualification of poet laureate, or for the nation or for individual American states. However, the third public examination was very costly. Few could afford it, and the majority had to be satisfied with a license. And the laurea, the graduation, was a ceremony of great public relations value, as you can imagine. It was a celebration of the power, the money, the honors that a graduate would obtain for himself, for his family, and for his social group in the course of his profession. Conferring the laurea, the laurel, was usually a religious authority who would give to the new doctor the symbols of his new status: a ring, a toga, a gown, a doctoral cap. Sometimes they would also include a glove. There would be another symbolic gift. The authority would embrace and kiss the new doctor while the audience applauded. This graduation ceremony was probably followed by a sumptuous banquet, paid, of course, by the wealthy and recently graduated student. The situation, meaning the extreme elitism in education, would change significantly, however, with the consolidation of the great central monarchies, European monarchies, in the 1500s. With the discovery of America and the expansion of the transatlantic trade, kingdoms needed a new class of administrators, especially in Spanish South America. So, in 1551, universities were founded in Lima, Peru, and Mexico City, in 1552 in Bolivia, in 1580 in Bogota, Colombia, to name a few. Returning to its origin, we can consider the university not only an innovation, but you can say a milestone in European culture. New cultural phenomena, on the other hand, bring with them new terms and a new lexicon, meaning a group of new words specific to the newly born culture, and or also existing terms with a new reassigned meaning. For example, the term university is the Latin universitas, originally meaning, of course, universality, the totality, the whole of everything. Today, the term university refers, as we all know, both to the building, the faculty, the students, and the subject that are taught in the university. But in the Middle Ages, two different terms were used, the studium and universitas. In medieval Latin, universitas meant any group of people organized to reach specific objectives, already an extension of the original meaning of universality in classical Old Latin. With the establishment of universities, the term meant the corporation or the assembly of teachers and students enabled to give opinions on the type of teaching given in different universities. The term studium instead referred to the content of the educational and research activity. Already the term facultates or faculty was used to identify various disciplines. Professors were either called magistri, that is masters, or doctores, that is doctors. At the University of Bologna in Italy, the masters, the magistri, were of an inferior status than the doctores. The teachers of law were also called domini or signori, which was actually a feudal term representing the authority of a feudal lord. And here is a bit of lexical trivia that, however, is symbolic of differences inside, I think, Western European culture. In England and the Anglo-Saxon world, we address an unknown person as Mr., which is a modification of master. And this came into use in the midst of the 16th century. Before, the expression my lord was frequent in Shakespeare, of course, for example. And on the other hand, in Mediterranean countries, notably Italy and Spain, the appellation for a stranger was and is signor or señor, which is a translation of dominus, which means God. In fact, the word our Lord translates into Nostro Signore, and in France they use monsieur, which is a literal translation of my lord. And this does not mean that who is master or a mister in England becomes a Signor God or a my lord in Italy or Spain. But just to hazard the theory, in the 16th, 17th century England, the country became a merchant nation, a nation of capitalists. And it is difficult to assign nobility, let alone godliness, to an unscrupulous capitalist. True, in England we also have Sir, an abbreviation from the Latin word meaning senior or a person of authority. And the use of Sir varies widely inside the English-speaking world and even in America, where in some places it's used more frequently than others. Today, a university teacher is automatically called a professor, but the term was first used as a title, for a teacher that is, only at the beginning of the 1700s, 500 years later, after the birth of the first European universities. Another lesser-known term born with the medieval university was the term bedellus, a word that in Italian schools even today refers just to a janitor. But the medieval bedellus was important. He had a supervisory responsibility, keeping order with the students and even monitoring that teachers performed their duties properly. I couldn't find the medieval image of this university supervisor, the bedellus, but he may have looked some like the character in this miniature, where the subject taught is, as you see, music. Now, so far we have looked at the positive or objective side of medieval universities, but not everyone was happy about them, or rather, people may have put up with university had it not been for the students. Even before universities were formally established, there were young European intellectuals, if we can call them this way, who liked to roam around various countries looking for luminaries. Today, we would call the luminaries, we would call them gurus, whose fame had reached the young intellectuals wherever they lived or resided. And these youngsters were first called roaming clerics, meaning roaming intellectuals. In time, with the establishment of universities, they were called with the French word goliard, a term whose etymology may have to do either with gluttony or with the biblical giant Goliath, which was one of the terms used to identify the devil, which will give you an idea. These roaming clerics, or intellectual, or goliards, were looking for knowledge no longer existing in isolated monastery, but in cities. For example, Paris, and the French monk of the 12th century writes, "They are accustomed to wandering through the world and to visit all the cities until the very knowing makes them go mad, because they are in Paris for the liberal arts, in Orleans for the classics, at Salerno for medicine, at Toledo for magic, but nowhere for good manners and moral principles." And these goliards often wrote poetry in Latin, and as a class or type, they blended with a new strain of poets or traveling entertainers, if you like. They composed poems to be sung, and the lyrics focused on two overarching themes: depiction of the lusty lifestyles of their composers as vagrant intellectuals, and fierce and satirical criticism of the church and of society at large. Unlike the chivalric theme of another strain of roaming poets, this new type of poets wrote drinking songs and reveled in riotous living. One of the largest and most famous collections of Goliardic poetry is, or rather were, the Carmina Burana, and not Carmina Burana, as I hear it pronounced when a station broadcasts the excruciatingly long modern opera by the title. As for universities, inevitably, a high concentration of students, male, rich, and free from parental restraints, made cities with university a hotbed of riotous living. In 1240, this is what Dominican preacher Jacques de Vitry says of Paris. He says, "Paris is like a goat with scabies, ready to infect the students from wherever they may come. So much so that fornication is not even considered a sin, anywhere and publicly. Near brothels, prostitutes are almost violent in assaulting the students who walk through the streets of the city, and those who refuse their offers, they call them sodomites. And not all students made a wise use of the money that their parents spent to give them an education and a position in life. And here is a letter written by a father to his son. I was deeply wounded with pain at the knowledge learned via the public voice and regrettably confirmed by many that after abandoning the literary studies from which we expected satisfaction and honors, you spend nights and days either gambling or in brothels or in the company of prostitutes. But to balance the picture, there is also an extant letter from a father to a son advising his son, that is, not to overburden his health with studying too much, to prevent someone from saying to the father, I know that your son is back and with the laurel of his graduation, at which the father would have to reply, yes, I should say, but for excess of studying he is dead, or he is ill beyond hope, or he has lost his sight, or he has become mad. But Buoncompagno da Signa was one among several teachers who wrote the equivalent of modern guides for students. His advice, if followed, would convert studying from a burden to a pleasure, or if not, a complete pleasure, at least a pleasant labor. Typically, the advice given was fear God, honor your teacher, read incessantly, ask questions on what you don't understand, and meditate deeply on what you learn from your teacher. Which seems an appropriate way to end this brief exploration of the birth of universities, institutions that have made so large mark in Western European culture, and by reflection also, of course, in American culture. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I am Jimmy Molnier for Historical Sketches. Good night.